Some moments are frozen in time, not by a camera flash, but by the sheer, unadulterated shock of a truth so explosive it shatters a lifetime of lies. In the opulent Grand Astoria ballroom, surrounded by New York's elite, one woman stood alone. She was 6 months pregnant, wearing a simple dress and being publicly torn apart by her mother-in-law, the city's most powerful matriarch. They called her a commoner, a gold digger, an unworthy stain on a pristine family name. But they were about to learn that blood isn't just thicker than water. Sometimes it's royal, and a queen, even one in hiding, never forgets how to command. The air in the Grand Astoria ballroom was thick with the scent of money, a cloying mix of imported lilies, vintage champagne, and the expensive perfumes of New York City's upper crust. It was an atmosphere Isabel Devereaux had never grown accustomed to, even after 2 years of marriage to Nathaniel Beaumont. Tonight it felt particularly suffocating. The crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, seemed to drip judgment from 1,000 points of light, illuminating her every perceived flaw. Her hand rested instinctively on the gentle swell of her belly, a silent prayer for the little life that was both her greatest joy and the source of her current predicament. She was 6 months pregnant, and the simple, elegant navy blue gown she'd chosen, the only maternity gown she owned that felt remotely appropriate, was a stark contrast to the glittering, jewel-encrusted sheaths worn by the other women. They moved like sharks in a diamond-studded sea, their smiles sharp and their eyes sharper. Isabel was, and always would be, an outsider. Her husband Nathaniel stood a few feet away, locked in a conversation with a senator. He looked every bit the Beaumont heir, tall, handsome, in his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, with a smile that could charm millions out of a foundation. He caught her eye and gave a small, encouraging nod. He loved her. She knew he did. He loved her quiet intelligence, her work as an art historian, the peaceful world she had built for them away from all of this. But here in his mother's domain, his love felt like a flickering candle in a hurricane. The matriarch in question, Genevieve Beaumont, held court near the grand staircase. She was a formidable woman, sculpted by ambition, and clad in a severe blood-red gown that seemed to absorb all the light around her. Genevieve was the CEO of Beaumont Global, a multi-billion-dollar real estate and investment firm she had inherited and tripled in value. Her annual Beaumont Foundation Gala was the social event of the year, a night where power, money, and influence converged under the guise of philanthropy. But for Isabel, it was an annual trial by fire. From the moment Nathaniel had introduced them, Genevieve had made her disdain for Isabel clear. Isabel was a nobody, an orphan with a scholarship-funded education and a past as blank as a fresh canvas. In Genevieve's world, a blank canvas wasn't an opportunity, it was a liability. A family tree without illustrious, moneyed branches was nothing but a weed to be pulled. Isabel, darling. Genevieve's voice, smooth as silk and just as strong, cut through the din. She had glided over unnoticed. You're looking comfortable. It was a masterclass in veiled insults. In this room, comfortable was synonymous with plain and unimpressive. Thank you, Genevieve. It's a beautiful event, as always. Isabel replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Genevieve's eyes swept from Isabel's simple pearl earrings down to her sensible heels, her lip curling in a barely perceptible sneer. I do wish you'd let my stylist assist you. Pregnancy is no excuse to let oneself go. The Beaumont name requires a certain standard. People are watching. The people were the board members, the investors, the society columnists, all the cogs in the great Beaumont machine. And the standard was one Isabel could never meet. She hadn't grown up summering in the Hamptons or learning the subtle art of social warfare at a Swiss boarding school. Her childhood was a quiet, book-filled one in a small town raised by a guardian who valued knowledge and kindness over lineage and lucre. Nathaniel finally extricated himself and joined them, placing a protective arm around Isabel's waist. "Mother, you look incredible, as should we all," Genevieve said, her gaze fixed on Isabel. "Your wife seems to be conserving her energy. Perhaps you should find her a seat before the main presentation. We wouldn't want her to faint from the exertion." The barb hit its mark. Isabel felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. Nathaniel's grip tightened a silent apology, but he said nothing to defend her. He never did. The fear he had of his mother was a tangible thing, a third person in their marriage. He was a good man, a gentle soul, but he had been raised in the shadow of this towering, iron-willed woman, and he had never quite learned to stand in the sun on his own. "I'm fine, Nathaniel," Isabel said, forcing a smile. "I was just admiring the orchestra." As Genevieve was called away by a fawning city councilman, Nathaniel leaned in his voice a low whisper. "I'm sorry, Izzy. She's just stressed. The new Hong Kong merger is giving her headaches. It was always an excuse, a merger, a hostile bid, a dip in the market. There was always a reason for the cruelty, a justification that Isabel was expected to swallow." She looked at her husband, at the handsome face she loved so much, and saw the familiar flicker of cowardice in his eyes. For the 100th time, she wondered if his love would ever be enough to outweigh the constant, soul-crushing weight of his mother's disapproval. She thought of the secret she carried, the truth of her own lineage that she had locked away years ago. She had promised herself she would leave that life behind, that she could build a new one on her own terms based on love and merit, not on a name. She had wanted Nathaniel to love her Isabel Devereux, the art historian, not the person she once was. But as the evening wore on, and the subtle digs from Genevieve's friends and allies began to pile up like tiny sharp stones, she felt the foundation of that new life begin to crack. She was being judged not on the content of her character, but on the perceived emptiness of her past. A past they knew nothing about. A past that could, in an instant, bring this entire glittering, arrogant world to its knees. The main presentation was the centerpiece of the evening. After the silent auction where yachts and private island getaways were sold for staggering sums, the guests took their seats at tables groaning under the weight of floral arrangements and fine china. Isabel was seated at the main table, a place of honor that felt more like a pillory. To her right was Nathaniel, looking increasingly tense. To her left, an empty seat reserved for Genevieve, who would be giving the keynote address. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the ballroom. A slickly produced video played on massive screens, showcasing the Beaumont Foundation's work images of smiling children in pristine art studios, all funded by the Beaumont corporate empire. It was a beautiful fiction, a veneer of benevolence over a core of ruthless capitalism. Isabel knew for a fact that 2 of the community centers featured in the video were being threatened by a new Beaumont luxury condo development. When the video ended, the master of ceremonies, a B-list celebrity with a blindingly white smile, took the stage. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce the visionary behind it all, a titan of industry and a champion for our children. The one and only Mrs. Genevieve Beaumont. Applause thundered through the room as Genevieve ascended the stage, looking regal and untouchable under the spotlight. She approached the podium, her movements deliberate and confident. She scanned the crowd, her eyes seeming to meet those of every important person in the room, before finally and pointedly landing on Isabel. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice resonating with power. "We gather to celebrate art, to nurture the next generation of creators. But more than that, we gather to celebrate family. For it is family that forms the bedrock of our society. It is the legacy we build, the name we pass down the bloodline that defines our future." Isabel's stomach clenched. She knew this speech. It was Genevieve's favorite theme: legacy, bloodlines, the sacred importance of a good name. Genevieve continued speaking of her late husband, of the empire they built together, and of her pride in her son, Nathaniel. "My son," she said, her voice softening with practiced affection as she gestured towards their table. "He is my greatest achievement. He has always understood the importance of our family's legacy. He has always made choices that honor the Beaumont name." Then her tone shifted. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a chilling edge. "Which is why, as we look to the future, to the next generation of Beaumonts, we must be more vigilant than ever. A legacy is a fragile thing. A strong bloodline can be diluted. A great name can be tarnished by a single ill-advised association." A nervous murmur rippled through the audience. They sensed the shift. This was no longer a standard charity speech. This was something else entirely. Nathaniel's hand found Isabel's under the table, his grip icy and damp. He was staring at his mother, his face pale with disbelief and dread. "My son is a man of great heart," Genevieve went on, her eyes locking with Isabel's across the darkened room. "Sometimes his heart is too big. He sees only the present, not the potential consequences. He can be charmed by a simple story, a seemingly sweet nature, without looking deeper into the background, into the breeding." The word hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Breeding, as if she were livestock. Isabel felt the blood drain from her face. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. People were turning in their seats, staring openly at her. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, a physical weight of judgment. A strong foundation is everything. Genevieve's voice rose, filled with a righteous, cruel fire. "You cannot build a skyscraper on sand. You cannot expect a thoroughbred from a common workhorse. The future of the Beaumont Empire, the future of my grandchildren, must be built on the same solid rock as its past: good stock, impeccable lineage, and a history that can withstand scrutiny." She paused, letting the implication sink in. She was methodically, surgically destroying Isabel in front of New York's most powerful people. She was painting her as a commoner, a gold digger, a weak link in the lustrous Beaumont chain. Isabel looked at Nathaniel, pleading with her eyes. "Do something. Say something. Stop her." But he was frozen, his mouth slightly agape, a statue of terrified inaction. He was as much a prisoner as she was. Genevieve wasn't finished. She was saving her most venomous strike for last. She was about to turn a character assassination into an execution. The silence in the Grand Astoria ballroom was now absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, broken only by Genevieve Beaumont's resonant voice, which she now lowered to a conspiratorial, almost pitying tone. It was the voice of a predator feigning sympathy for its prey just before the final strike. "We all wish for our children to find happiness," she said, a manufactured tear glistening in her eye. "But we also have a duty to protect them, to protect our heritage. When a young woman with no family, no history, and no resources of her own suddenly appears and attaches herself to a name like Beaumont, one is forced to ask questions." Isabel felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was beyond anything she had ever imagined. This wasn't just a private cruelty. It was a public execution. She wanted to stand up to run, but her legs felt like lead. She was pinned to her chair by the collective stare of the room. One must ask about motivation. Genevieve continued, her gaze sweeping over the rapt audience before landing once again like a physical blow on Isabel. Is it love, or is it a calculated ambition? Is it a desire to build a life together? Or is it a desire to secure a life of luxury she could never hope to achieve on her own? Every word was a dagger. Isabel could feel the judgment of the room hardening against her. In their eyes, she could see the narrative taking hold. She was a schemer, a social climber who had trapped the kind-hearted Beaumont heir. Nathaniel finally broke his paralysis. "Mother, that's enough." He hissed, his voice a low, strangled sound that was swallowed by the cavernous room. Genevieve ignored him completely, as if he were a petulant child. She held up a hand to the audience, a gesture of faux magnanimity. "I know what you are all thinking. This is a private, family matter. But is it? When the future of a company that employs thousands, that shapes our city's skyline, is at stake. When the next generation, the very heir to this legacy, is in question." And then she delivered the killing blow. She turned her body fully towards Isabel, her expression a mask of cold, clinical appraisal. Her eyes dropped pointedly to Isabel's swollen abdomen. "We are told there will soon be a new Beaumont Genevieve," announced her voice, dripping with venomous insinuation. "We are expected to welcome this new arrival, to celebrate it as the continuation of a great line. But a legacy as significant as ours demands certainty. It demands proof." A collective gasp went through the ballroom. It was an audible, physical shockwave. The implication was monstrous, unmistakable, and unforgivable. In front of 700 of the city's most influential figures, Genevieve Beaumont was not just questioning Isabel's character. She was publicly questioning the paternity of her unborn child. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The chandeliers above blurred into streaks of light. The faces in the crowd became a grotesque, gaping mural. All Isabel could hear was a high-pitched ringing in her ears and the thunder of her own blood. The pain was so sharp, so profound, it was almost physical. It was a violation, deeper than any she had ever experienced. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was an attack on her child, her baby. She looked at Nathaniel. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with a horror that was matched only by his own impotence. He looked from his mother on the stage to his wife at the table, his loyalties tearing him apart in the most public way imaginable. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. In that moment of silent, paralyzed cowardice, something inside Isabel broke. The hurt, the shame, the years of quiet endurance, it all fractured. But beneath the fragments, something else was stirring. It was not anger, not yet. It was something colder, older, and far more powerful. It was the dormant instinct of a woman who had been trained from birth to understand that a name is not just a label, but a weapon, a shield, a declaration. Genevieve Beaumont, in her blind arrogance, believed she was speaking to Isabel Devereux, the quiet orphan. She had no idea who she had just insulted. She had no concept of the ancient, powerful beast she had just awakened. While the crowd remained frozen in stunned silence, Isabel slowly, deliberately placed her napkin on the table. Her movements were no longer timid or uncertain. They were fluid, precise, and imbued with an authority that seemed to come from nowhere. She pushed her chair back, the soft scrape of its legs against the marble floor, echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. And she stood up. The act of Isabel standing was in itself a defiance that sent a ripple of fresh shock through the room. All eyes which had been fixed on the monstrous spectacle Genevieve was creating on stage now swiveled to her. She was supposed to cry. She was supposed to flee in humiliation. She was supposed to be broken. But she was not. She stood perfectly still beside the table, her posture ramrod straight, her chin lifted. The simple navy dress that had seemed plain moments before now appeared as a uniform of quiet dignity. The spotlight operator, sensing the shift in drama, instinctively widened the beam from the stage, catching Isabel in its halo. Now there were two women illuminated the aggressor at the podium, and the target who refused to be a victim. The silence stretched taut and agonizing. It was a void where every guest was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable emotional collapse. They expected tears, a shouted denial, a desperate appeal to her husband. Isabel gave them none of it. Instead, she let the silence hang, let the weight of Genevieve's accusation fester in the air. She met her mother-in-law's triumphant, hateful gaze with an expression of unnerving calm. The panic and pain that had momentarily blinded her receded, replaced by a clarity so sharp it was almost glacial. The blood that ran in her veins, the blood of ancestors who had faced down armies and navigated the treacherous courts of Europe, began to sing a familiar song of resolve. She thought of her guardian, a stern but loving man who had taught her history not as a series of dates, but as a lesson in power, duty, and survival. "Dignity is the one thing they can never take from you unless you give it away," he used to say. "Never give it away." She glanced at Nathaniel. He was finally on his feet, his face a mess of shame and fury. "Mother, for God's sake, stop this!" he pleaded, his voice cracking. But it was too late. The damage was done. And Isabel knew, with chilling certainty, that Nathaniel's intervention now was meaningless. He should have acted sooner. He should have defended her honor before it was so publicly shredded. His failure to do so had severed a vital cord in their relationship. She was in this moment utterly and completely alone. And in that aloneness, she found a strange and terrible strength. She turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over the first few rows of tables. She saw the faces of people who had snubbed her for 2 years, the sneering board members of Beaumont Global, the condescending wives of Nathaniel's business partners, the gossip columnists who had chronicled her every perceived misstep. She saw pity in some eyes, morbid curiosity in most, and a cruel satisfaction in a few. They were all witnesses. They were all complicit. Genevieve, seeing Isabel's composure, seemed momentarily thrown. This was not the reaction she had engineered. She had expected a mess, a dramatic scene that would prove Isabel's unsuitability for their world. This quiet, unbreakable poise was something she hadn't anticipated. She tried to regain control. As I was saying, Genevieve said, her voice a little too loud, a little too sharp. "The Beaumont legacy demands absolute certainty." She was cut off, not by a shout, but by a sound so unexpected it startled everyone, the soft, clear tap of a fingernail against a crystal water glass. Ting! Isabel had picked up a microphone from the center of the table, one reserved for toasts and announcements. She tapped it once, a small, polite sound that nonetheless sliced through the tension like a razor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every eye was already on her. She held the microphone and took a deep, steadying breath, not for courage, but for control. The storm was no longer just around her. It was inside her, and it was about to be unleashed. "Mrs. Beaumont," Isabel said. Her voice, amplified by the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system, was calm, clear, and carried a resonance that no one in that room had ever heard from her before. It was a voice accustomed to command. "You speak of names, of legacy, of bloodlines. These are subjects on which you are, I'm afraid, dangerously ill-informed." A collective intake of breath swept the room. The sheer audacity of Isabel's quiet rebuke stunned the audience more than any shouted defense could have. Genevieve Beaumont, a woman who commanded boardrooms and terrified politicians, had been told she was ill-informed by the very mousy girl she was trying to destroy. Genevieve's face, a mask of triumphant cruelty, just moments before, now flickered with confusion and burgeoning rage. "How dare you?" Genevieve began. But Isabel continued, as if she hadn't spoken, her voice unwavering. "You have for the past 2 years addressed me as Isabel Devereux. That is the name I chose to live by, the name of the wonderful woman who raised me after my parents' death. It is a name I cherish for its connection to a life of peace and anonymity," Isabel stated, her eyes never leaving her mother-in-law's. "But it is not by right of birth my name." She paused, letting the statement settle. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Nathaniel stared at his wife, his expression a mixture of awe and utter confusion. "Who was this woman? You speak of my background as if it is a void." Isabel went on, her tone becoming colder, more formal. "You are correct that my family is not listed in the New York social diary. You will not find our summer homes in the Hamptons. Our wealth is not measured by the fluctuating value of skyscrapers, but by centuries of land art and history. My family's name is not Beaumont. It is von Alderberg." The name meant nothing to most of the people in the room. It sounded vaguely European old. But to a select few, the older, more educated members of the elite, the Swiss bankers, the international diplomats scattered amongst the guests, the name landed like a cannonball. Eyes widened. Whispers erupted like sparks in dry grass. A man at a front table, a stern-faced German industrialist named Klaus Richter, slowly lowered his wineglass. His eyes fixed on Isabel with dawning recognition. Genevieve, however, was merely enraged. Von Alderberg. "What nonsense is this? Some fabricated tale of a long-lost—" "What, Duchess, don't be absurd. You are a nobody, and no fantasy will change that." Isabel gave a small, sad smile. It did not reach her eyes. "There is no fantasy, and the title is not Duchess." She straightened to her full height, her bearing regal, her voice ringing with an ancient, unassailable authority that transformed the very air around her. "My full and legal name," she declared, her voice resonating through every corner of the Grand Astoria ballroom, "is Her Serene Highness Princess Isabella Sophia von Alderberg of the former Sovereign Principality of Alderberg." Silence. A complete, profound, and absolute silence. The kind of silence that follows a lightning strike when the world seems to stop breathing, waiting for the thunder. She then did something that sealed the truth of her words more effectively than any document could have. She looked directly at Genevieve Beaumont, her expression not of anger, but of pity as one would look upon someone who had committed a catastrophic and irreversible error in judgment. "And the child I carry," she added, her voice dropping but losing none of its power. Her hand resting protectively on her stomach is not merely a potential heir to your fleeting corporate dynasty. He or she is the direct descendant of a royal house that was ruling its own sovereign state when your ancestors were still peasants in Normandy. This child will carry a bloodline that has shaped European history for 900 years. The thunder finally crashed. The room erupted. It wasn't a loud noise, but a massive, sibilant wave of whispers, gasps, and the frantic, furious tapping of thumbs on smartphone screens as 100 people Googled von Alderberg. Mr. Richter, the industrialist, was already on his feet. He gave a short, stiff bow from the waist in Isabel's direction, a gesture of profound, old-world respect that cut through the chaos. From the back of the room, another figure began to move forward. He was a distinguished, silver-haired man in a diplomat's tuxedo. It was Maximilian von Hesse, a cultural attaché at the German consulate, and an old family friend Isabel had invited as her personal guest. He had been watching the entire scene unfold with quiet fury. He stopped beside Mr. Richter and spoke in a clear voice that carried to the surrounding tables. "The House of von Alderberg is one of Germany's mediatized princely houses. Their sovereign rights were lost in the 19th century, but their title rank and private fortunes were all guaranteed by treaty. Her Serene Highness is the head of her house. To insult her is unthinkable." On stage, Genevieve Beaumont's face had gone from red with rage to a ghostly mottled white. The name, the title, the confirmation from von Hesse. The pieces were clicking into place with horrifying speed. She was a woman who dealt in power, and she was suddenly sickeningly aware that she had just picked a fight with a form of power she didn't understand, but which was ancient and formidable. She had publicly humiliated a commoner. That was a social victory. She had publicly insulted and questioned the legitimacy of a European princess. That was a declaration of war, a catastrophic, world-altering mistake. Isabel held the microphone for a moment longer, her gaze sweeping over the chaos she had created. Then, with a quiet click, she turned it off. She placed it carefully back on the table. Her public statement was made. The rest would be handled privately and with devastating precision. She turned and began to walk away from the table, her back straight, her steps unhurried. She didn't look back at her husband, who stood frozen between the stage and the table. His world shattered. She didn't look at her mother-in-law, who was visibly trembling on the stage. She had walked into the gala as Isabel Devereux. She was walking out as Princess Isabella von Alderberg, and nothing would ever be the same. The moment Isabel began to walk, the spell of frozen shock that had gripped the ballroom shattered into 1,000 pieces of frantic activity. The hushed whispers exploded into open conversation. Society columnists were no longer discreetly typing notes. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones into their phones, dictating the story of a lifetime. The sound of camera shutters, which had been silent during the humiliation, now clicked with a desperate, predatory fervor as photographers tried to get a shot of Isabel's retreating form. The power dynamic of the entire evening had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of a tectonic event. Genevieve Beaumont, who moments ago had been the sun around which this entire universe orbited, was now a pariah on her own stage. The spotlight that had illuminated her power now exposed her catastrophic folly. People weren't looking at her with admiration anymore, but with a mixture of horror, pity, and a palpable sense of schadenfreude. She had flown too close to the sun, and her wax wings, forged from arrogance and cruelty, had melted completely. Nathaniel, jolted into action by the sight of Isabel, leaving, stumbled after her. "Izzy." "Wait, Isabel, please," he called out, his voice raw with desperation. He reached her near the grand exit, grabbing her arm gently. She stopped and turned to face him. The look in her eyes was not one of rage or hysteria. It was a look of profound, devastating disappointment. It was the look of a woman who had seen the very core of his character and found it hollow. "Let go of my arm, Nathaniel," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. I didn't know," he stammered, his mind reeling. "A princess. Why didn't you ever tell me I did?" she replied, her voice laced with a sudden, weary bitterness. "I tried to tell you twice. Once when we were first engaged. You laughed and said you didn't care about old family stories, that you loved me for who I was. The second time was 6 months ago. I told you there were things about my family you needed to understand. You were late for a meeting with your mother. You told me we could deal with the boring stuff later." The memory hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. He remembered it clearly. She had been serious, and he had dismissed her with a kiss on the forehead, too preoccupied with the Beaumont empire to listen to his own wife. "Isabel, I am so sorry. For that, for tonight, for everything. Let me fix this," he begged. "There is nothing for you to fix," she said, her voice final. She carefully removed his hand from her arm. "Your mother just publicly accused a sovereign princess of being a whore and her unborn child of being a bastard. This is no longer a family squabble, Nathaniel. This is now an international incident being handled by my family's chancellery in Zurich. You will likely be hearing from our attorneys, men who handle matters for the Alderberg Global Trust." As Isabel spoke, a short, balding man in a rumpled suit who had been standing near the coat check scribbled furiously in a small notebook. He was Robert Peterson, a senior investigative journalist for the Wall Street Journal. He hadn't come for the society gossip. He'd come to track rumors about a Beaumont global acquisition. But he had just stumbled upon something infinitely bigger. The name Alderberg Global Trust was the key. It wasn't a well-known entity to the public, but in the highest echelons of global finance. It was a legend. A ghost. The trust was the notoriously private multi-generational wealth management fund for a handful of Europe's oldest and most discreet aristocratic families, including, it was now terrifyingly clear, the House of von Alderberg. They didn't build skyscrapers or seek publicity. They moved markets. They were the silent partners behind some of the world's largest private equity buyouts, owned vast, unpublicized stakes in blue-chip companies, and had the power to make or break entire corporations with a single quiet phone call. Peterson suddenly understood. Genevieve Beaumont hadn't just insulted her daughter-in-law. She had insulted the living embodiment of one of the planet's most powerful and secretive pools of old money. His mind raced. He remembered an anonymous source telling him months ago that a mysterious European trust was the silent financing behind the hostile takeover bid that Beaumont Global had barely survived last year. A bid that had cost the Beaumonts nearly $1 billion to fight off. He connected the dots with a jolt of journalistic ecstasy. The trust that had almost gutted her company was likely controlled by the very family her son had married into. Genevieve had been playing checkers, while her daughter-in-law's family was playing 3D chess, and she had just, in a fit of pique, knocked the entire board over. Back in the ballroom, Genevieve had finally stumbled off the stage, her face a mask of horror as she began to grasp the magnitude of her error. Board members who had been fawning over her an hour ago now avoided her gaze. Her allies were melting into the crowd. She saw Klaus Richter speaking animatedly with a group of investors gesturing towards her with a look of utter contempt. She had made herself, and by extension, Beaumont Global toxic. In her world, reputation was currency, and she had just declared bankruptcy in the most spectacular way possible. Isabel walked out of the ballroom doors and into the grand lobby, leaving the chaos behind her. Maximilian von Hesse was waiting for her, holding her simple cloth coat. "Your car is waiting." "Your Highness," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of concern and pride. He helped her with her coat. "The family office in Zurich has been alerted. The jet is on standby at Teterboro. We can be airborne in 2 hours." Isabel paused, her hand on her belly. For a moment she looked back through the doors at the imploding world she was leaving behind. She saw her husband, standing lost and alone in the middle of the room, the perfect picture of a man who had just lost everything and finally realized it. No, Isabel said, a new strength hardening her resolve. "I'm not running. I'm not going to Zurich. I'm going to the penthouse, the one my husband and I are supposed to share." Maximilian looked surprised. "Are you sure that's wise?" "My mother-in-law wanted to talk about legacy and family homes," Isabel said, her voice as cold and sharp as a diamond. "Fine. Let's talk about them. She has just laid siege to my life and my child's future. She is about to find out that a princess knows how to defend her own castle." The ride up to the Beaumont penthouse was silent. Nathaniel sat opposite Isabel in the private elevator, the cavernous space feeling more like a courtroom. He had tried to speak twice, but the words died in his throat under her calm, unreadable gaze. The man who had left the apartment that evening, confident and slightly condescending, was gone. In his place was a stranger, stripped of his inherited arrogance, his face etched with a fear and desperation Isabel had never seen before. When the elevator doors opened directly into the sprawling living room, with its panoramic views of Central Park, the tension followed them in. The apartment, which had once felt like a beautiful shared sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Isabel walked to the center of the room and turned to face him, her coat still on. She was no longer just his wife. She was a foreign power, an entity he had completely misjudged. "You have 2 choices, Nathaniel," she began, her voice devoid of its earlier warmth. It was the voice of a CEO, a strategist, a ruler. "And you will make your choice tonight." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "Isabel, I love you. That is my choice." "Love is not a choice. It's a feeling," she corrected him coldly. "Loyalty, honor, courage. Those are choices. And you have failed to make them at every turn. What you feel is irrelevant right now. What you do is all that matters." She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the glittering city lights. "Choice 1. You side with your mother. You annul our marriage. You support her claim that our child is illegitimate, and you try to weather the storm she has created. In this scenario, the Alderberg Global Trust, which I can now tell you holds a controlling interest in the 2 European banks that hold the majority of Beaumont Global's debt, will call in those loans. Simultaneously, our network of investors will initiate a hostile takeover. We will dismantle your mother's company, sell it for parts, and the Beaumont name will be a footnote in the business pages within 6 months. You will be left with nothing." Nathaniel stared at her, his blood running cold. The hostile bid from last year, it had been them. A warning shot, he hadn't even known was fired. His mother had fought a battle against a ghost, never realizing the ghost was sleeping in her son's bed. Choice 2. Isabel continued, turning back from the window. You side with me. And when I say side with me, I don't mean a quiet apology while you continue to let your mother run your life. I mean a complete and total severance. You will call an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. tomorrow. You will use the voting shares. I know your father left you the ones your mother has convinced you never to use against her. And you will vote with a coalition of board members I have already been in contact with. You will vote to remove Genevieve Beaumont as CEO and chairwoman of the board. Nathaniel was stunned into silence. You've been in contact with board members? For the last 6 months, Isabel confirmed without a flicker of emotion. Ever since your mother accidentally had my name left off the deed to this apartment. I realized then that she would never see me as family, only as a threat to be managed and eventually discarded. I do not allow threats to my family to go unmanaged. The quiet art historian was gone. In her place was a princess who had been playing a long, strategic game while he had been utterly oblivious. She had been preparing for this war long before the first shot was fired tonight. You will take over as CEO of Beaumont Global, she commanded. You will issue a public statement apologizing unreservedly for the slander against my name and the questions raised about our child. You will announce a complete change in company culture. And your mother will have no role, no title, and no access to the company ever again. She will be forced into retirement. In exchange for this, the Alderberg Trust will not only stabilize your debt, but will invest a further $2 billion into the company, securing its future and yours. You will have the empire you were always meant to inherit, but it will be on my terms. You will be a husband and a father first, and a son second. That is the only way our marriage and our family will survive. She stood before him, a queen offering terms of surrender. The choice was brutal in its simplicity, his mother or his future, the toxic past or a reforged life with his wife and child. For a long moment Nathaniel was silent, the enormity of it all washing over him. He looked at Isabel, truly seeing her for the first time, her strength, her intelligence, her hidden power. He saw the woman who had loved him enough to hide a crown, and the princess who was now willing to burn down his mother's world to protect their child. And in that moment, the years of fear and conditioning fell away. He finally understood what his father, a man who had also lived under Genevieve's thumb, had tried to tell him on his deathbed. Be your own man, son. Don't live in anyone's shadow. He walked towards Isabel, and instead of begging, he simply took her hands in his. They were trembling slightly. I choose you, he said, his voice thick with emotion but clear with conviction. I choose our child. I choose us. I should have done it 2 years ago. I should have done it tonight. My whole life. I should have chosen this. I'll make the call. The board meeting is at 9 a.m. A single tear, the first she had shed all night, traced a path down Isabel's cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of victory, but of a profound, painful relief. Perhaps there was something left to salvage after all. The war for her dignity was over. The long, difficult work of building a new legacy, a Beaumont von Olderberg legacy built not on cruelty and arrogance, but on a foundation of newfound strength and hard-won loyalty, was just beginning. The hours between midnight and dawn were the longest of Nathaniel's life. The sprawling penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a command center for a coup he was being forced to lead against his own family. After making his choice, Isabel had not coddled him or offered effusive praise. Instead, she had shifted into a mode of calm, decisive action that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. "The first call you make is to Michael Soloway," she instructed, her voice steady as she handed him a glass of water. "He's on the board's audit committee. My contacts have already spoken with him. He knows about the debt leverage and the trust's position. He will be your first ally." For the next 3 hours, Nathaniel, guided by a list Isabel had produced from her handbag, made a series of phone calls that systematically dismantled his mother's reign. He spoke to board members, division heads, and key investors. With each conversation, his voice grew stronger, shedding the last vestiges of the frightened son and taking on the tone of a leader. He was no longer just relaying Isabel's terms. He was owning them. He spoke of a new vision for Beaumont Global, one of stability, transparency, and a move away from the aggressive high-risk strategies his mother had favored. He was leveraging the crisis of the evening into a mandate for change. The most difficult call came at nearly 4 a.m. It was to his mother. Genevieve answered on the first ring, her voice a ragged, desperate whisper. "Nathaniel, what is happening?" "The press is calling. Our stock is going to plummet. You have to fix this. You have to denounce that woman. Tell them it was all a lie, a delusion." No, Mother. Nathaniel said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth she was used to hearing. Isabel stood by the window, giving him the space to have this final, painful conversation alone. "What do you mean?" "No," Genevieve shrieked. "She has ruined us." "No," Nathaniel repeated, a profound and sorrowful certainty in his words. "You did. You did this. To her, to our family, and to the company. Isabel is my wife. Her Highness, Princess Isabella, is the mother of my child. And you publicly slandered her. There is no coming back from that." He could hear her choked sob on the other end of the line. "So what now? What do we do?" "There is no we," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I am calling an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. I am exercising my voting shares. I have the support of the majority. You are to submit your resignation effective immediately. If you do it quietly, your retirement package will be honored. If you fight this, you will be removed for cause, and Isabel's family will proceed with not only the financial dismantling of the company, but a civil suit for defamation that will strip you of everything that remains." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with the weight of a shattered dynasty. "You would do this to me?" Genevieve finally whispered, her voice broken. "Your own mother." "You made me choose, Nathaniel," said his own eyes welling with tears. "And I choose my wife. I choose my child. Goodbye, Mother." He ended the call before she could reply. Slumping into a chair, the emotional toll of the night finally hitting him. Isabel came over and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She said nothing. No, I told you so. No victory lap. It was a gesture of quiet solidarity, an acknowledgement of the profound loss that had been necessary to secure their future. At 8:45 a.m., they arrived at the Beaumont Global headquarters. They walked in together, a united front. The office was buzzing with whispers and furtive glances. The story of the gala had spread like water. When Isabel, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored grey dress, walked in beside Nathaniel, the entire lobby fell silent. Her quiet dignity and his new resolute demeanor told everyone that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The boardroom was electric with tension. Genevieve was not there. In her place at the head of the table sat her lawyer, looking grim. The proceedings were swift and brutal. Nathaniel, in a clear and commanding voice, opened the meeting. Michael Soloway immediately tabled the motion for a change in leadership. One by one, the board members cast their votes. It was unanimous. Genevieve Beaumont was out. Nathaniel Beaumont was appointed interim CEO, pending shareholder confirmation. Just as the vote was finalized, Isabel's phone buzzed. It was a message from Maximilian von Hesse. It read, "The Alderberg Global Trust has just purchased a controlling interest in Beaumont Global's primary debt holder. The loans are secure. Your family is safe. Congratulations, Your Highness." Isabel closed her eyes for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of the vast, invisible power that had just been wielded on her behalf. She had not just won a personal battle, she had secured an empire for her child. As the meeting adjourned, Nathaniel came to her side. The board members who had once looked through her now approached her with deference, offering their congratulations to them both. She was no longer just the CEO's wife. She was the princess who held the keys to their survival. Looking out the boardroom window at the city skyline their family now controlled, Nathaniel took her hand. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Isabel turned to him, a faint, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time that day. "Now," she said, her hand resting on her stomach. "Now we go home. We have a nursery to prepare." The war was over. The price had been paid in full, and for the first time in the quiet aftermath of the storm, they were no longer just the Beaumont heir and the hidden princess. They were simply a family ready to build their own legacy on their own terms upon the ruins of the old one. And so in the fallout of a single catastrophic night, an empire was reforged. Genevieve Beaumont's reign of cruelty ended not with a bang, but with a quiet vote in a sterile boardroom, a consequence of a battle she never knew she was fighting. The story of Isabel and Nathaniel became a modern legend in the halls of power, a cautionary tale about judging a book by its cover, and a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the noise you make, but the quiet, unshakable dignity you refuse to surrender. Isabel, Princess of Alderberg, proved that a title doesn't grant you power. It's the strength of your character that makes you worthy of the title. She saved her marriage, secured her child's future, and transformed a toxic dynasty, proving that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most powerful of all. What did you think of Isabel's incredible transformation? Was Nathaniel's choice the right one, or was it too little, too late? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of hidden strength and ultimate vindication, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own power, and be sure to subscribe for more unforgettable, real-life dramas. Thank you for listening.